Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala nabiy al-kareem wa ala alihi wa ashabi ajma'in amma ba'd. There are many stories in our history that often get glossed over. Now, one of the problems we have today with history is that we tend to focus only on specific eras of our history. And the rest of the 1,400 years is forgotten about. And in this history, there are many amazing stories. Some of these stories you'd think they were works of fiction, but they're actually historical events. And today I want to narrate one of these stories to you and perhaps extract some lessons from it. This is a story that in many ways would have led to the birth of the modern world. It was the beginning of a series of events that would have led to the birth of the modern world. But it's a part of the story that's often overlooked. And this is the story of a man in our history known by the name of King Abdur Rahman I, also known as Abdur Rahman Ibn Muawiyah, or the Falcon of the Umayyads. And this story goes back to the 2nd century of Islamic history. So for those who are unaware, the first dynasty to rule over the Muslim world were the Umayyads, and the second were the Abbasids. And this story takes place at the time when the Abbasids are taking over from the Umayyads. So the Umayyads, this family ruled the Muslim world for about 70 years. And towards the tail end of those 70 years, the general public began to get tired of them, because many of the later Umayyads did not live up to the ideals of Islam. Many of them had fallen into major sins openly. They were at civil war with each other. They were usurping the funds of the Muslims, and this had caused people to want somebody else to take over. So another family, the Abbasids, began to rally politically to get people on their side so that they could take over. Now, to understand the politics of the region, the Umayyads and the Abbasids are both Quraysh. Right? These are two different tribes of the Quraysh. The Abbasids are the descendants of the Prophet's uncle Abbas. That's where they get their name from. So they are Banu Hashim. And the Quraysh, going all the way back to the time of the Prophet ﷺ, the Quraysh, their leadership was always disputed between Banu Hashim and Bani Umayyah. So the same tribal dispute is popping up 100 years later. And the Abbasids, to get people on their side, they begin to politically campaign. They tell people, we're going to do things more Islamically, we're going to do things better, we're going to bring things back to the way it was in the time of the Khulafa al-Rashideen. They have a lot of these political rallies and a lot of these promises. And so eventually they gain enough support that they are able to stage a coup and take over the land. Now, very often when we study this part of history, what we study next is what the Abbasids did, right? And the Abbasids did some amazing things in the next 200 to 300 years. But what we don't study is what did the Umayyads do next. Right? We know that the Abbasids took over from the Umayyads that year. What did the Umayyads do next? This is another fascinating part of our history that's often overlooked. And this is where the story of Abdur Rahman comes in. Because Abdur Rahman was the last Umayyad prince. He was the last of the Umayyad bloodline at that time. So, again, I have to point this out whenever we study history. The figures in our history after the time of the Sahaba are human. They're going to do good things and bad things. Right? They're not awliya, they're not perfect saints, they're not a representation of the religion, they're human beings. There's good and bad in them. And so the first Abbasid ruler, one of his bad qualities was that he was quite murderous in claiming power. His nickname was actually Abbas the Butcher. Right? And he got this nickname, the Butcher, for butchering the Umayyad family. And there are many stories of how he did it. The most popular one was that he invited the last 50 princes of the Umayyad bloodline for a feast. And he hid 50 assassins behind the curtains. So while they were feasting, the entire family was wiped out overnight. Some people say the story is not authentic, Allah knows best, but whatever happened, we do know for sure that in the time of Abbas, the butcher, in his time, the Umayyad family was massacred. And it boiled down to just two princes were left, Abdur Rahman and his brother. They were the only two left of this family. And they went on the run. So understand this story. Abdur Rahman spends his whole life as a prince. Right? He's Abdur Rahman, the son of Muawiyah, the son of Hisham, the son of Marwan ibn Hakam. His grandfather and great-grandfather were Umayyad kings. Right? His father was a prince and he was also a prince. So this is a man born into royalty. And suddenly he's a refugee. He's a fugitive. There are assassins and police looking for him everywhere. He goes on the run. And many stories happen when he's on the run. One of the stories that happens is very soon after he realizes that the Abbasids are after him, he and his brother and his servant, they jump into the river to swim across to Egypt. Right? So there's the river separating Arabia from Egypt. They jump into the river to swim across to get to Egypt. And he manages to swim across the river. And when he turns around, he sees his brother swimming back. And all the assassins are on the shore waiting for his brother. And they promised him that if you come back, we won't harm you. Right? Often false promises that politicians give. And in front of his eyes, from one side of the river across the other side, he sees these assassins grab his brother and chop off his head. And so just like that, there's now only one prince left in the Umayyad dynasty, Abdur Rahman. And he goes on the run, he goes into hiding. He manages to go to Egypt. The ruler of Egypt at that time, his name was also Abdur Rahman. And he had wavering political allegiances. At one point he claimed to be loyal to the Umayyads, at another point he claimed to be loyal to the Abbasids, but what he really wanted, he wanted to be king himself. He wanted to be the Khalif himself. So initially, he lets Abdur Rahman live in Egypt, right, as a refugee. So Abdur Rahman goes from living as the prince in Damascus to living as a refugee in Egypt. But, Abdur Rahman was a very charismatic person. And people flocked to him, and people rallied around him. And eventually, the king of Egypt, or the governor of Egypt, begins to get worried that he's going to lose, his political power. That people are going to want this Umayyad prince to be their leader instead. So he hatches a plot against Abdur Rahman himself. And once again, Abdur Rahman finds himself on the run. Running now from both the Abbasids and the rulers of Egypt. Both of who want him dead. And they say he spent up to 10 years in exile. And we don't know much of what happened in these 10 years because he's undercover, he's changing his name, he's living a secret life, he's a fugitive, he's a refugee. Everywhere he goes, there are assassins after him, there are spies trying to figure out who he is, where he is. People know he's alive, they don't know where he is. And they want him dead. And this man spends the next decade on the run. Eventually, he makes his way to Morocco, the land of his maternal ancestors. His mother was from Morocco. And here he finds family, his mother's family, and he's able to live a simple life and to at least be away from the politics of the East. So a man born as a prince in Arabia is now living as a refugee in Africa. But his story doesn't end there. Across the ocean from Morocco was the land of Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain. And Spain was very loyal to the Umayyads. You see, early Spain owed a lot to the Umayyads. It became a Muslim land in the time of Walid I. It began to truly develop in the time of Umar bin Abdul Aziz. And so people there, in general, were supportive of the Umayyad family. They saw them as people who liberated them, who brought justice, who brought prosperity to their land. And there were a lot of people there who were related to the Umayyads and who loved the Umayyads and who supported them. So Abdur Rahman, he's still a politician at heart, even though he spent 10 years as an exile. He sends his servant over to Spain to find out what's it like on the land. Are people supportive of us? Are they supportive of the Abbasids? Whose side are they on? And when he arrives there, there's a civil war going on in Spain. Because the Abbasids had appointed a new governor over Spain, and many people rejected him because they didn't want the Abbasids ruling. And so there's now a civil war between many of the local governors and the new representative of the Abbasid Empire in Spain. And all these others who were rebelling against the Abbasids, they learned that Abdur Rahman is still alive. He just across the ocean in Morocco, and they all say they're going to give him his full support. And so Abdur Rahman takes a ship, he crosses the ocean, he lands in Spain, where groups of armies and governors and leaders are waiting for him to accept him as their new leader. And he leads them into battle, and he conquers Spain. And he establishes Spain as a new kingdom, Umayyad Andalus. And he declares himself the Amir of Andalus, the king of Andalus. Think about it. This is the kind of story you think is fictional, but this is history, this is real history. This is a man born as a prince in Damascus, spending most of his life as a refugee and a fugitive. When he died, he was the king of a country in Europe. He was the king of Spain. Imagine today if a refugee from Syria became a king in Europe. It sounds mind-boggling, but it happened in our history. And his story doesn't end there, because the Abbasids sent armies to fight him, and he defeated those armies, and he won the respect of the Abbasids. In the beginning I said that his nickname was the Falcon of the Umayyads. It was the Abbasid king that gave him that nickname. When people asked the Abbasids, what do you think of this Abdur Rahman guy claiming to be king all the way in Spain? He said, that man's the Falcon of the Umayyads. The Abbasids were amazed by the tenacity of this man, who overcame all odds and somehow established a kingdom in a completely different part of the world, and was able to oppose their own power. They didn't like him, but they respected him. They respected him, and from that point onwards, the Ummah had two major kingdoms. There was Umayyad Spain, and there was the Abbasid Empire. And interestingly, both kingdoms would enter a golden age at the same time. And Abdur Rahman's descendants would rule over Spain for 290 years. See, these are parts of our history that are forgotten. So many people, when you ask them about the Umayyad Empire, they think, oh, the Umayyads ruled for 70 years. And they forget the 290-year Umayyad Spain, which, by the way, was the better Umayyad Empire in many ways. Really, if you study the history of the Umayyad Spain under Abdur Rahman and his descendants, that was in many ways the superior Umayyad Empire, in terms of their accomplishments, in terms of what they did for this world and for this Ummah, in terms of the kingdom they developed. Because under Abdur Rahman's descendants, Spain became the most powerful country in Europe. It became the most advanced, most developed, most sophisticated, most cultured community in all of Europe. It became the envy of Europe. Even Muslims from other parts of the world, Muslims from the Abbasid Empire, will look at Umayyad Spain, and the nickname they gave it was Jannah on earth. That was the kind of kingdom he developed, Jannah on earth. And so this is a story of Abdur Rahman I. And I narrate it so that we can become more aware of the history, of the broad history of the Muslim world, so we can take some inspiration from his story, and so we can understand, both the good and the bad of what happened in our history. At the end of the day, none of the figures in this story are perfect. None of the figures in these stories are what we would call awliya or saints or ulama. These are politicians. They had their good qualities and their bad qualities, but they were Muslims. And their legacy is also our legacy, and their story is also our story. And it's important that we familiarize ourselves with the history of the Muslim world, not just with the main story, in this case the Abbasids, but even the other stories as well, like that of Spain. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun, wa salamun ala mursaleen, walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعين ونستغفره ونؤمن به نتوكل عليه أما بعد. So what can we learn from the story? It's very important that when we study history with the prime focus of taking lesson from it. History is not about memorizing names. History is not about memorizing dates. History is, what can I learn from the successes of those who came before me? What can I learn from the failures of those who came before me? How can I repeat their successes? And how can I avoid their failures? The first lesson that we learn from the story of Abdur Rahman is a refutation of a myth that is present in the minds of many Muslims. Many Muslims, because we haven't studied history, we have this myth in our mind that this ummah had one Khalifa until World War I. That this ummah had one ruler, it was one unified empire until the downfall of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. This is a myth. In reality, this ummah had only one ruler for the first 100 years. Once Abdur Rahman established Umayyad Spain, we now had the Abbasid Empire and the Umayyad Empire coexisting for 290 years. And he never ended there, because then the Fatimid Empire would pop up, the Murabit Empire would pop up. By the time of the Ottomans, you had the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire, the Mamluk Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and many others all existing at the same time. It's not one ruler ruling over the entire Muslim world. The problem with this myth is that people then have unrealistic expectations. They think that the solution is if you have one ruler, all our problems go away. That's not true. Even when the Ummah had one ruler, there were still problems. I just lead the lives of the Khulafa Rashidin. There was never a perfect time. So we need to be careful how we portray history. That we are honest about our history, and we don't make up things to make it sound better than it was. History is human, and what happened, and we shouldn't lie about it. This ummah, it is part of its destiny to be divided. We still try our best to unite whatever we can, but we don't lie about our history. We say that this is what happened and this is the way it was. Now let's go to some personal lessons we can take from the story, because there's really a lot of motivation you can take from the story. This is a man who went from a prince to a fugitive to a king, who was born in the Middle East, in Syria, who spent a large portion of his adult life as a refugee in Africa, and who died as a king in Europe. Right? This is an amazing story. And from the lessons we can take from this is, number one, that perhaps you dislike something and it is good for you. Right? Perhaps you dislike something and it is good for you. This is a proverb taken directly from the Quran. That Allah tells us in the Quran that perhaps you dislike something and it is good for you. Perhaps you love something and it is bad for you. And throughout history we see this. That very often something bad would happen to someone that in the long run it leads them on a journey that leads them to their destiny. We see this with the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, when his brothers throw him in the well, and that's the beginning of his story that leads to his destiny in Egypt. And we see this in the story of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he is exiled from Makkah, which leads him to Medina, where the story of Islam truly blossoms. And that's why the Hijrah is the beginning of our calendar. And we see it again with the story of Abdur Rahman. In reality, Abdur Rahman was never in line to be king. Right? The Umayyads had over 50 princes. He was like number 40 in that list. He was never in line to be king. Right? If the Umayyad Empire continued, he would have just lived the life of a prince in Syria. But Allah's destiny for him was something else. Allah's destiny for him was to be a king in Europe, in Spain, and for his descendants to establish one of the greatest empires in the history of this world. And so that series of events, as horrific as they were, as traumatic as they were the necessary part of history that led to him getting to where he needed to be to establish what he needed to establish. And this is the history of the world even today. Very often we look at things in the world today and we feel like, why did this happen? In the long run, there is benefit for it. Let me give you an example. One of the things that many of us believe is the worst thing to happen to Muslims in recent times was the migration of Muslims to non-Muslim lands. Right? For 1,400 years, or rather for 1,300 years, Muslims did not migrate to non-Muslim lands. We live together in Muslim world, right? In Darul Islam. In the past 100 years, first the migration to South Africa, then we have Europe, then we have America, and so, a lot of people think this is a bad thing. And in some ways it is. But what we don't think about is the other side. The amount of people in these lands who have converted to Islam, who would never have been exposed to the message of Islam had our forefathers not been forced to migrate. Think about it. It was Allah's will that the people of these lands hear the message of Islam and be exposed to Islam. And the way for that to happen was that somebody had to be forced to migrate to that land and to take Islam to that land. We don't think about this. If Allah wants Islam to spread in a certain land, sometimes political events happen that we don't like, that force people to move out of their lands to new lands because Allah wants them to be in that land, not in the land they were born in. Because that's where they're going to make a difference for this ummah. And so we take this lesson from a man born in Syria and died in Europe. We see that Allah wanted his destiny to be somewhere else and to be something else. And perhaps it was the same for our forefathers as well. That for many of us, our forefathers came to Africa just trying to make a better living. But because of that, Islam is spreading in this land. And the same thing is happening in many other parts of the world. And it's up to us to make the best of the situations we're in and to understand whatever Allah has willed, whatever qadr Allah has willed for this ummah, in the long run it is what is best for this ummah. Another lesson we take from the story of Abdur Rahman, and we'll end with this lesson, is never give up. If you have a goal that you think is beneficial, that you think is worth chasing, don't give up. Abdur Rahman won the respect of his enemies because of his tenacity, because of his never give up attitude, because of his ability to take the worst of situations and build something great from it. Even his enemies had to recognize that this was an amazing man. And today we give up too easily. We live in the age of instant gratification. We start a business, and if we're not millionaires by the end of the year, we close down the business. That's not how it works. You want to accomplish something, you need to take 10, 20 years. You need to take your time. You need to work towards your goal. You need to deal with the problems. You need to face your obstacles and overcome them. Nothing worth accomplishing gets done overnight. And this is a lesson we can take from Abdur Rahman. It took him a long time to turn his life around and make something of it. But he never gave up. At the end of the day, he accomplished something amazing. Because when you look at the history of Umayyad Spain, it is in Umayyad Spain that we see the development of universities. We see the development of philosophy. We see the birth of the ideas that would spread to the rest of Europe, causing the Renaissance. The Renaissance that caused the modern world. But it all goes back to the day that the Umayyad Spain was established. It's all linked. All of history is linked in this way. The golden ages of the Umayyad Empire led to the golden ages of the rest of the world as well, because knowledge was shared between different civilizations. And so we learn today not to give up. We take inspiration from stories of people who were in difficult situations and made something good of it, and were able to accomplish great things. We take lessons from that not to give up. And we take lessons from that to accept our destiny and to understand that Allah knows what is best for us, and that perhaps we dislike something and it is good for us. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار ربنا هب لنا من أزواجنا وذرياتنا قرة أعين واجعلنا للمتقين إماما سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين أقم الصلاة